Let's try it.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. How's that?
Slowly forward, make sure it's not too deep. Good.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Look at that beard.
I could put footprints on there if you want to do dance stuff.
They want us to do a book signing right after this, and I would say I'm happy to do it. The only thing would be getting us there, so maybe like you could say like right after this, we can do that.
So are you?
Going to sing a song now from the hymn book. It's Touch the Earth Lightly. I'm not sure if everyone knows it. It's one song that we really like a lot. Touch the Earth Lightly. It is on page 569 in the New Century Hymn Book. Wonderful, oh, great. Touch the Earth Lightly. It speaks to our stewardship of the earth. Touch the earth lightly. Nourish the life of the world in a If the rainbow comes to surround us for the children we who in danger to breathe out. Help Teach us the purpose, Christ bringeth us. Beauty of Isn't that a wonderful song? What a great message. And now we're going to do one that you may not be familiar with. It's called We Say Yes, written by Marty Ogden. It's in alphabetical order in the song sheets, and the chorus in particular, I believe, you'll find easy. It's page 7 of the song sheets. We say yes. We'll just do the chorus real quick. No, I'm just going to do it as you go. Just you'll get it. Okay. For the gift of families dear, tender hearts that hold and guide us, never comes but living or death, they walk beside us. For all that has been, for your blessings without number, we offer thanks to you, for God, and for all that shall be, for all that is to come. We say yes, we say yes, for thy gift of faithful friends, walk with us through joy and sorrow, until love that we have done. Drawing our hearts the praise to follow, for all that has been, for your blessings without number, we offer thanks to you, for God, and for all that shall be. For all that is to come, we say yes, we say yes, for creation with all reflects your heart and features, like you teach us to cherish all your creatures, for all that has been, all your blessings without number, we offer thanks to you, for God, and for all that shall be, for all that is to come, we say yes, we say yes. I want to close this segment of the singing so that we'll have lots of time. With what does the Lord require is found on, I think, on the same page. So those of you who know it, sing out, please. There are 3 parts. I will do just 2 of them. What does the Lord require? Justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your love. To seek justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your love. What does the Lord require? To seek justice and love kindness and walk humbly with to seek justice and love kindness and walk humbly with your love. Amen. We are at the hour.
Hey, hey, hey! Good afternoon, good people! I know this happens. You eat lunch, you absorb a little vitamin D, and you think, I'm gonna go sit in the sanctuary and have a nice little... Wrong. Is Mike here? Oh, good. Because I was gonna say, you know, our keynoter's here. The guy who's supposed to introduce her isn't here. But hey, you people out there, yeah, we're talking to you. Come on in. Yeah, that's right. They're like popping their heads in. The door's open. All right, so we're ready. We're eager. We're well fed. Are we? Well fed? Yes, okay. You know, if you're hungry, that's one of the things you got to ask. If you're hungry, go find a cookie. Mike, old buddy, old pal. Come on up, introduce.
First, just a little logistical announcement that some of you might be interested in. Both Christina and Lillian will be signing books immediately following her presentation or keynote today, and then before the workshop. And then after the workshop, Lillian and Christina will also be signing books, and they're going to be doing that at the volunteer table out in the lobby. So just so you know that. What that will require, though, is that when she does finish up her keynote, just sort of you do ideally on the airplane when you need to let somebody through. Just go ahead and let her through first, and then everybody else feel free to follow. Part the C's, yeah. So, I don't know, maybe 7 years ago now, I was at the time, one of the association co-ministers for the Chicago Metropolitan Association, and Lillian was from a church from a neighboring association, and once in a while we had lunch. And so on that day, again, 7 or so years ago, we sat down and had lunch together, and almost towards the end of the conversation, Lillian leans back in her chair, and she says, Mike, let's talk about your vocation. And I was like, okay, let's talk about my vocation. There is this conference, the Pacific Northwest Conference, that is looking for a conference minister, and I think you should put your name in. Now, for many of us who have read Lillian's books or read her writings or read her devotionals, I think those in some way are some form or fashion of Lillian leaning back and saying, friend, let's talk about your vocation. Lillian being able to bring that voice to what vocation is, what faith is, within this time and place is one of her gifts and one of her skills. I am so happy she is here present with us today. I am so looking forward to the workshop that she and Lillian and Christina do afterwards, talking about some of those places where their topics clearly overlap. And so it is with great pleasure that I introduce our keynote speaker for this afternoon, Reverend Lillian Daniel.
Can I tell them my real claim to fame is related to you, Mike? Yes. All right. This is my first and last matchmaking experiment. But I take some credit for getting Mike and Lauren Cannon together on their first date. Lauren was my intern at the First Congregational Church in Glen Ellen, and of course she couldn't date her association minister back in Chicago, but once he moved out here, I said, I think, Lauren, you guys ought to connect somehow. And she's like, well, he lives all the way out in Seattle. I was like, well, it's not like it's going to be anything serious. I mean, just go for coffee. And it was my enormous honor to get to co-preside at their wedding. It's a real loss to the Chicagoland area. We still miss having Mike there, but I know that you appreciate his gifts in ministry here. Mm-hmm. And Lauren's as well, yes. And Leo. Okay, so just over a year ago, this book came out. It was my third book. It was called When Spiritual But Not Religious Is Not Enough, Finding God in Surprising Places, Even the Church. It's my third book, and I thought I would just say a little word to you today about what led to that book and then what the reaction has been to it and what are some of the things I've learned in the last year and a half. It's my third book. The first book I wrote was about testimony. It was called Tell It Like It Is, and it was about trying to get sort of open-minded Protestant mainline people to talk about God. In New England, even. I was in New England at the time, and it was a dissertation for my doctoral ministry degree. I'd done a multi-year experiment in my church in New Haven, trying to get people to give testimony in worship, to stand up and talk about their experience of God. And it could be about absolutely anything as long as it began with God. And so if you want to talk about why New Haven needs a living wage, that's fine, but it had to begin with God. And our mantra was, what could you hear here in church that you could not just as easily hear on NPR? Mm-hmm. Or you could say Fox News, right? But in New Haven, that was more our tendency. After that, I moved 10 years ago out to the very different environment. I was in a liberal college town in New England for 14 years, New Haven, Connecticut. And then I went out to the Republican, affluent western suburbs of Chicago, where the dominant form of Christianity was megachurch conservative Christianity. So in some ways you could say that New England was probably more similar to the ethos here, where you all are. But then I moved into kind of this place where Christendom still exists. There is a presumption of Christianity, but it is a particular form of Christianity. I tried testimony out there too, and I'm still at it. I love it. And in some ways, this third book is a continuation of that conversation. How do we proclaim our experience of the living God in this weird little branch of the family? And when I say family, I know That is such a loaded statement, and one that we've been thinking about. What are the presumptions we make when we lump ourselves together or say we are this and others are that? But there is this weird thing, this mainline, you can call it, liberal Protestant, you can call it. Increasingly, I like to just say open-minded Christian churches, because I'm learning that denominations and borders and stereotypes like that break down so easily. But for our people, say the United Church of Christ, on average, talking about our experience of the living God is not our strong suit. It may even be fair to say that we are more likely to tell our neighbor how to vote than where we go to church. Witnessing on justice issues early and courageously, yes. Witnessing to an experience of Jesus, not so much. Now, I don't believe for a second that we don't experience Jesus. I don't believe for a second that we don't experience the divine. But I believe that in our desire over recent decades to represent a more welcoming, inclusive form of the church, we lost our ability to talk about our faith, period. And so we developed this sort of weird fear of public speaking, not on controversial issues. I mean, we will pass resolutions telling people in the Middle East what they need to do to achieve peace, because our delegates are experts, right? We'll pass resolutions on health care, on gay marriage, but we won't talk about our faith, because here's the irony, it might offend someone. Mm-hmm. Now, part of it, I understand, is that we don't want to, in witnessing to our faith, sound like other people who've witnessed to their faith who have done it in an obnoxious or even a cruel way. Some of us have actually been injured or hurt by people who witnessed to us in the name of their Christian faith, but did so in a way that told us we were going to go to hell, we were not among the elect, or that whatever form of Christian we were didn't count. And so afraid of sounding like those burn in hell people, we just stopped talking about the divine. And when we stopped talking about it, we got out of practice, and we ended up with a situation where there's one group of Christians who's vocal and eloquent about their experience of the divine, and the United Church of Christ or other denominations like it get characterized as places where there is no movement of the Spirit. So increasingly, my project is to try to figure out how you can, in a multi-faith world, and in a theology in which you really don't believe that your neighbor who doesn't go to your church is going to go to hell. Like, I really do not believe that anybody is going to go to hell for not being a member of the United Church of Christ. Now, the opposite could be true, but I mean, I do not sit awake at night worried that my unchurched neighbor is going to hell, right? But guess what? The burn in hell argument doesn't work for anybody these days. It doesn't work in the evangelical world. It doesn't work, period. There's a huge skepticism around that. A recent Barna study that comes out of the evangelical world was quizzing young people about what their perception was of Christianity, and they had two dominant comments. One was that they associated Christianity with an inappropriate involvement in right-wing politics. These are the young people who came up through the 80s and the moral majority, right? And they associated Christianity and the church with homophobia. Those are the two things, right? And the burn in hell argument isn't working for anybody. I just love you so much, and I'm just worried about you, and I want you to come to my church, and otherwise you're going to burn in hell. And we have a fantastic junior high program, burn in hell. It doesn't work for anybody, right? But what we did is, in our desire not to do the burn in hell argument, which I think
we were appropriately suspicious of early and courageously, right? But in our desire to not do that, we instead said, well, whatever floats your boat. We decided that the opposite of saying you're going to burn in hell was to say it doesn't matter. And yet it's disingenuous because it does matter to us. If it didn't matter, you wouldn't be spending this beautiful sunny day in this church building. If it didn't matter, you wouldn't be worshiping every week. And so it is disingenuous when a new neighbor moves to town or on your block or in your building and you tell them where the best deli is and where the best dog walking spot is, and you don't mention your church and you say to them it doesn't matter. It is disingenuous. Clearly it matters. Clearly it matters. So in writing the book, When Spiritual But Not Religious Is Not Enough, I tried to make an argument for why religious community mattered. I did so using irony and sarcasm in some places, ranting and raving in others. In some ways I try to show and not tell by telling stories of a church that perhaps is not the church that the Barna study people expect to see, a church that is complex and has different points of view in it, a church that is funny, that is fallible, that is goofy. I mean, you have to admit, a lot of why we go to church is because it's hilarious. I mean, it just is. It's just funny when you get people together and the stuff we do. When I wrote When Spiritual But Not Religious Is Not Enough, I got a big response from lots of different groups. Apparently there's a lot of atheists who spend a lot of time on the internet. I'm very familiar with them now. And the irony is, by the way, I mean, every atheist I know, we all know atheists are you know, really laid back, positive people, but not the ones who spend all their time on the internet. And so they're like furious because they say, oh, I'd insulted the spiritual but not religious by implying that, you know, like religious community matters. So how do we get to a place? I mean, this really fits with the kind of hard conversations that Christine Cleveland is encouraging us to have and to think about. But how do you make a case for something and not just immediately get shut down because you've offended somebody, right? Like how is it that we're in this state where once somebody says, I'm offended, it's game over, right? And what that does is that shuts down the conversation. It doesn't make it go away. It just takes it away from the people who would be offended, and we all end up in our silos, right? And we're in a state right now in this country that I think is very frightening, where we all have the ability in this culture of rampant narcissism, and I think we live in a culture that is so thick with narcissism and self-centeredness, it's like the air we breathe, we can't even see it. We can't even see it, right? I know you heard some about the self-esteem movement and some of those things, but we live in this culture of narcissism, and part of that is that we all get to decide not to ever be offended. And the way you're not ever offended is you make sure that you only get your information or you hear the opinions of people that you can predict you are already going to agree with. And so now increasingly we don't all share a daily newspaper, and you know, where you might say, well, that newspaper has this political bent, but we still read it and we have to sort of have a shared dialogue about it. We can all get our news in these very different ways, and nobody is affected by anybody else's point of view, and heaven forbid you say I'm offended and it's game over, and we just go in our corners. And you see this in the worship world as well. I mean, there are many ways in which the narcissistic culture, worship rubs up against it like sandpaper at its best, and then there are ways in which that culture pervades the church, because, I mean, you know, it's not like narcissism is this evil thing out there. It's this thing in here, and we bring our human nonsense into the buildings, right? And so in the church, you see examples of that kind of culture of narcissism coming in when we have these weird sort of social contracts, like I have to be guaranteed in worship that I will never hear any form of music that I do not already like. Okay? Like that's been dressed up as good taste, right? Or history, or being current, or being young, or being old, or what. It gets dressed up and all that. Guess what? It's the culture of narcissism. I don't have to hear anything ever that I don't like, and I'm going to have a sign on the door that's going to proclaim to me that this is not going to offend my precious, precious taste. You see the culture of narcissism coming into church when, people say things. Well, it used to be 10, 20 years ago, when people said that they shopped for a church, they said that with a certain amount of embarrassment or chagrin. I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but we shopped for a church. Today, there's no irony, no chagrin. We shop for a church. Now, let's talk about that. Some of that is positive. Like, it is no longer the case that you can presume a market share, and that because everyone in your family is Presbyterian, you're going to be Presbyterian, and you're going to get married to somebody Presbyterian, your children are going to be Presbyterian. And in the old days, if you broke that social contract and married someone outside the religion, families would split up over it. You don't see that very much today. I think that's a good thing, right? I like the idea that we have some freedom of choice, that we're not just expected or like robots going forward. In the old days, you might be driven to choose a community of faith because there might be economic gains in it, business connections, there might be other reasons, but reasons other than your desire and calling by the Holy Spirit to experience the living God and community. There are a whole bunch of other reasons, right? And so the great thing for me is, like, I never experienced any of that. I never had a church full of people who were going to make business connections, right? Chances are, if you go to my church in Glen Ellen, you're going to lose business connections. That's the reality, right? If you go to church and you worship something other than yourself for an hour on a Sunday, you are doing about the most countercultural thing you can do in a culture of narcissism, and that is real. That is real. But you see that coming into the churches and pressing up when people say things like, well, I went to worship, but I didn't get much out of it. And it's like, well, it wasn't directed at you. Yeah. I get it sometimes. I don't like the prayer of confession. You don't like the prayer of confession. You're not supposed to like it. Like, it's supposed to be kind of a painful moment, Yeah, it's a downer. Yeah, I should hope so. It's the prayer of confession. I mean, this is, but also this idea that what worship is there is to meet our needs, right? And part of it is that in this increasing smorgasbord of the religious landscape, multi-faith, the biggest news story of last year was the Pew study. The Pew study came out and they said that 1 in 5 people in this country, when asked what their religion is, checks off none, N-O-N-E, not N-U-N. And when you get to the group that's under the age of 30, it's 1 in 3, right? Now, we can wring our hands and say, oh, what about the good old days? I don't wring my hands. I couldn't have even been a pastor in those good old days. I actually kind of like it that I look out a congregation of people who I presume want to be there. I think that's sort of cool. I also think it's cool that people are allowed to have the freedom to say, I choose none. You don't have to get married in a church. You can be authentic to where you are. But in that landscape, if we do care about religious community, can we make a case for why it matters? And can we do that with some passion? What I think has happened is that if you don't do the burn in hell argument, and you do the whatever floats your boat argument, it's tremendously uncompelling. And we can't be surprised then that people are not excited about the church. And when we do make an argument for the church, often we do it in this utilitarian culture of narcissism meeting your needs way. Like we say, our church has an excellent youth program. Right? The implication there is that the church is here to meet your needs, you will gain something. Our church has an outstanding choir. Well, guess what? There's an outstanding community chorus where I live. You don't have to go to church to sing. Our kids, our youth, many of them are overscheduled. You don't have to go to church, right? What does the church do that nobody else can do? If we're not talking about God and some kind of experience of that, if we're not talking about a tradition that is deeper and richer and bigger than we are, if we're not talking about a community of people that isn't just the people who are exactly our age or whose kids are our kids' age or who live right next to, if we're actually trying to do this thing called church, we've got to talk about God and the tradition and the ways in which it's probably not about making your life better. The reality is that, to me, my Christian faith gives my life depth and meaning in the hard questions. When my life is going well, I don't particularly need it. When it's going badly, the culture of narcissism and the gospel of self-esteem fall apart and unravel. So if we sell the church as some sort of life-improving scheme, you'll just feel so much more peaceful after you go. At some point, it's going to be Good Friday, and they're going to find out that our Savior died on a cross at the age of 33, and this is not a self-help religion. What it is an opportunity to join with an amazing tradition, thousands of years old, going back further to Judaism, to Midrash, to communities of faith where they have argued and wrestled with the question of why hard things happen. They've asked hard questions of God and the text. People have spent years of study taking apart a word of Hebrew or of Greek. People have debated over coffee. People have actually put some time and effort into this. And in a culture of narcissism, when people say, how dare you presume I need somebody to interpret this for you, I think it is appropriate to push back and say, is this the last acceptable prejudice these days among people who would otherwise perceive themselves to be without prejudice? The prejudice against religion. And when I say that, it takes the form so often, to my mind, as a trivialization of the religious life. And that people talk about the religious life in a way that they would probably be horrified if someone took some aspect of their life that was meaningful to them and talked about it in the same way. And it's become acceptable, it's become a source of humor. We are shallow in the public square around these issues, and shallow at our peril, because if we don't understand and respect one another and respect the importance and depth of these different communities, we're going to be in big trouble. Big trouble. So let me give you an example of one way in which the culture of narcissism trivializes the religious life, and see how you might offer a different vision. I'm going to talk for just a moment about another subject, but I'm going to use some of the terms and arguments that are often used against religion. I had a rotten time in high school. I didn't enjoy it. It was a difficult time in my life. People were cliquey, they were unkind. Maybe there's some teachers who care about the students, but I didn't have those teachers. Those teachers didn't care. And therefore, I'm offended that you would even suggest I should go to high school. Like that chemistry teacher, like who says she can teach me about chemistry? Like there's only one way to do chemistry? I was created with the ability to understand all science. How dare you presume that you have something to teach me about that? That is offensive to me. Furthermore, that chemistry teacher, you know what? She doesn't care if you learn chemistry or not. She pretends she does, but you know what? She gets paid to teach you chemistry. Furthermore, when you look at the history of the entire world, pretty much every war in the last century has involved weapons that have somehow been influenced by chemistry. And not only that, but when you look at every military leader, everyone has gone to high school. Therefore, I'm offended that you would even raise the question of high school with me, and I think the world would be a lot better off without it. Now, now if somebody talked to you like that, you would say that's crazy talk. You can't. You're making these blanket assumptions. But how often do you hear people talk about religion in this way? What if, when somebody talked like that, we were to say something about it and say, you know what? I'm shocked to hear you make a statement like that, because I can't imagine you doing that about another group of people, and I'm just going to kind of reflect back to you what that feels like to me, that the religious world is diverse and complicated, and so is Christianity, and you know, you don't have to join my church, but please don't talk about us in that way where you mistake the part for the whole. We have a way of describing that. It's stereotyping. Instead, what if we did make an argument for why religious community matters, and even say, apply the minimal standards that we apply to other areas of our lives. Look at our kids' lives and some of the minimal expectations they have. The idea being, I can't just stand up here and declare to you that I'm a concert violinist. Right? I can't declare to you, I can't say, how dare you presume that there's this way to play the violin, and you know, that's outrageous and that diminishes my natural musical appreciation. No, I mean, you would say that's ridiculous, right? If I picked up a violin now, you would not want to hear me on it. And so to even say, you know, I participate in a community of faith, and I go to worship, and I study the text, and it's really hard, and it's this weird book, and I argue about it with other people, and I put time into it in much the way that you might practice the violin, and I go deeper, and my particular church is this one here, and that doesn't mean that I denigrate others. I just want to sort of tell you about the value and meaning of going deep in one place, in the same way that I don't try to study every musical instrument that was ever invented, but I might go deep and try to study the violin. And the truth is, once you train that musical ear, it doesn't make you hate other instruments. It actually means you are more likely to appreciate the beauty of other instruments. You have learned how to appreciate, to hear the music, to appreciate the divine. In the same way they've done studies on when you teach children a foreign language at a younger age, they are more likely to be able to learn others. They don't learn one foreign language and say, that's it, I'm against every other foreign language. I mean, you have that exposure and you are opened up to appreciate it. So can we, while affirming a multi-faith world, make an argument for a religious practice that is rigorous, reasonable, and real? What do I mean? Well, real, like the Barna study. I mean, we have got to acknowledge that people come into our religious communities with their addictions and with their issues and with their sexuality and with their whole selves. And country club religion is nowhere. People come with a deep hunger and thirst for the divine, generally because they have been abused and broken by the world, and the gospel of self-esteem has let them down. And so real, yes, real about people, but also real about the divine. We are not yet another social service agency. We are not the United Way. I don't want to see churches advertise, we deserve your money because we give 20% of it away. Sorry, that's not, like, if that's what I wanted, I would do it differently. To stop justifying in these utilitarian ways and say, what your gift goes for in the church is to continue this teaching and this practice in this community that has been around for thousands of years, that has value, real. And rigorous. Like anything that we value, if you put more effort into it, you'll get more out. If you go deep, you will have more depth. It is not the case that we have standards about every other area of our life except for this one where we say, who cares? And also rigorous in that when we love each other and care about each other, we tell each other the truth. And to say, whatever floats your boat, or I could care less what you do, I hope is not the truth. And finally, reasonable. The times in which the Christian church is portrayed as a doctrinal battleground, we have got to tell a different story. We've got to name the idolatry around belief that has captured much of American Christianity over the last 100 years. We've got to acknowledge that the fundamentalist movement that began over 100 years ago when a bunch of folks freaked out at a meeting in Princeton about the German scholarship was coming over and said, let's just agree on these 5 things, the virgin birth and this and that. We have got to take responsibility for the fact that we let that be the story that is still out there, and that we have allowed ourselves to be captive to an idolatry around belief, the obsession with what we believe or don't believe, that in the United Church of Christ, our sin is not fundamentalism, but it is a different kind of fundamentalism in that we will tell you who we are based on what we do not believe, and we struggle to make a positive case for what we do. Reasonable. Let's acknowledge and not be frightened to say that we have a diversity of understandings of theology and belief in our pews, that there are people who believe that Jesus was born of a virgin, and there are people who don't, and some of our people think both things in the same week. But we also acknowledge that, hello, we are not the first generation to notice that there are different versions of stories in Scripture, that the Bible is maddeningly inconsistent, that there's nowhere in the Bible where Jesus says, you have to believe my mother was a virgin. Let's acknowledge that there have been thousands of years of Jewish midrash and debate among rabbis in which they have wrestled with and debated the inconsistencies of Scripture. And here's a newsflash: they weren't stupid hundreds and thousands of years ago. They knew they were putting together a book that had inherent inconsistencies, and they could live with a sense of mystery and debate and diversity and argument, even, heaven forbid. And we are not the first genius generation to notice that there are different birth story narratives. Look at this, they're different. I think they knew that when they put it together. So what does it leave us with? Well, what have I learned in the last year of talking about this subject in really interesting groups of people? I've had emails from rabbis in Israel who said, oh my goodness, you're so late to the party, spiritual but not religious. We've been dealing with cultural Judaism for many generations, and even more so in the country of Israel. I had the amazing experience of being invited to speak to the annual gathering of nationally of the Unitarian clergy who were not unanimously excited about my coming because of I've been criticized from all sides of the Christian family, including that one, and those who worry that by calling out some of the presumptions of some of the spiritual but not religious, I have therefore alienated them all, that they were all about to walk into our churches, and then I wrote this, and now they're not coming anymore. But I've also learned, one of the things I've learned is that I can't say this enough either, that I want to acknowledge there are people who have been injured and hurt by the church and by religious communities, and that's not who I'm talking to. Those are people who really require love and prayer and kindness, and that's the reality. And I learned that in an intense way when I was invited to speak to the Gay Christian Network, which is a primarily evangelical group. And they worship in a very evangelical style, and I brought my own biases and prejudices that could basically be summed up as, well, why the heck don't they come to my church? And it's like, guess what? They don't want to. Those jerks, they want to reform their own. You know, narcissists. Why don't you come to my church? What was powerful for me in that conversation, the Gay Christian Network, was their big question was, how do we find a church community? And the question they posed to me again and again was this: do I have to choose, or how do I choose between these two choices that are offered me? I can go to an evangelical style church in which the worship truly moves me and I experience the living presence of God, but I'm considered a second-class citizen if I'm myself and I am not considered a full participant in my humanity. Or I can go to a church like yours that affirms me as who I am, but where there's no movement of the Spirit. They characterized our churches as the bland leading the blind. When that question was posed to me, I thought about it deeply, and I end up pushing back and saying I reject the whole dichotomy. If those are the only two choices, you've not yet found the right church. We've got to let go of our assumptions that evangelical churches are this and mainline churches are that. It's all changing with the religious landscape. There's amazing fluidity. We're all influencing each other. Huge numbers of Roman Catholics coming into the UCC are changing us. Every community of faith is changed by everybody who joins it. I also push back sometimes to say it's not only that I pray that you find a community that will meet your needs, but maybe God is calling you to be a gift to some other community that needs you. Reasonable, rigorous, and real. And finally, a concluding story. I got invited to the Festival of Homiletics in Denmark. No doubt you've heard of it. And so it's this amazing minister from Denmark who wanted to start a festival of preaching, and this was the second annual one, and I had the privilege of going, and again, talk about narcissism and self-centeredness. It was like a week before I went. I wrote her an email. You do know I don't speak Danish, right? And she's like, no, we'll do the whole thing in English. I mean, that's humbling, right? And in Denmark, it's a state church, and it's a tiny church, and the ministers are paid much like social workers by the government. And they do baptisms and weddings, but tiny, tiny, tiny numbers of people coming. They think the American church is so vibrant and alive. They think, we're booming and they're compared to them. And I went there, and they don't get a lot of training in preaching. I mean, it's a whole different world. And it was also my experience there that I perceived them, to be somewhat reserved. But of course, they're doing this whole thing in another language as well. So I was like, you're not laughing at my jokes, and I was like, maybe they're not funny when they're translated into Danish. But I wanted to get to know more about the church, and so at the breaks I would ask, what should I do while I'm in Copenhagen? It seems like such a wonderful place. And the people I talked to were just so modest about this beautiful city. And I would say, what do you think I should do here? I just love it. It's so beautiful. Well, it's nice, and you have nice cities in America also. And I said, no, but this is so special, and the water, well, it's okay. And, well, what should I do while I'm here? Well, what do you like to do? And, well, I hear you have a great museum. Yes, it is nice. I just couldn't get anything and I was like, what, if I left here and didn't do these things in Copenhagen, would I die unhappy? And they were so modest and quiet. And finally, one guy looked at the other, he says, we had a festival with music and food and singing and art, but it is finished. We can laugh at that story, but if we're not careful, that's us. Tell me about your church. Well, I'll tell you what I don't believe. Well, why do you go there? What's it like? Well, I'll tell you what it's not like. We're not like those churches that won't ordain women. We're not like those churches that won't do your gay wedding. Yeah, but what do you do? What do you believe? Well, we certainly don't believe anyone should tell you what to believe. Okay, but what do you believe? We had a festival. It is finished. I would counter that with Christ is risen. He is risen, and thank you.
Woo! Lillian's tinier than me. That's wonderful. Or as Monty Python would say, we're not quite dead yet. Awesome. Thank you, Lillian. Friends, we're going to have a transition time and then moving into workshops. If you will, bear with one brief announcement from Carol. Carol Scott Kasner, where are you? There she is. And I hope you understand that these announcements are mainly because this is what families do. They talk to each other.
Hi, I'm Carol Scott Kastner, member of this church, and I am a specialized minister of the spirituality of aging and spiritual direction. And I need your help. How many of you are getting older? How many of you have congregations that are getting older? Oh, yes. Okay. How many of you feel sincerely that you're serving their spiritual needs well as they age? Maybe, maybe not. Okay. It's a ministry we're all invited to that often we don't have time to focus on. And I will invite you to help me with something. This summer, from August 21st to 24th, and there's a bigger picture of this in the narthex, Saging International, which is an organization about the spirituality of aging, is having its international conference in Seattle at Seattle University. And it's going to be amazing. 3 days of real depth work on the inner work of aging, how to age in a spiritually healthy and vibrant manner. And I need your help. I'm going to put these in the back of the room. If you would be willing to pick up this sheet and take it home and use your newsletter or your bulletin or something to spread the news to your members about this, we'd love to fill it with wonderful UCC people from all over this conference. So thank you.
Okay. Up.